I told Daddy this was going to be my nomination for him to join the ranks of the Hall of Fame at East Carteret High School. Here we go. My dad was one of the first middle school athletes in that first year that they had an athletic program in Carteret County in 1966. He played baseball, basketball, and football at East Carteret. He was all-conference in the Northeastern 3A conference in all three sports his senior year. That conference included Greenville, Kinston, New Bern, Washington, Tarboro, Elizabeth City, Bertie, Roanoke Rapids, Havelock, and West Carteret. In baseball, he was a catcher for 3 years on a team that tied for the conference championship his senior year and is still remembered by some, especially Joe Boy, as one of the most accomplished baseball teams to ever represent the school. In basketball, in addition to all conference honors, he was the first ever East Carteret recipient of the Carteret County News Times Player of the Year in 1970. In football, he was invited to play in the boys' home bowl game the summer after his senior year, where he was the starter and caught a touchdown pass that got the attention of the new ECU football coach, Mike McGee, who invited him to join the ECU freshman class of 1970. His career there was not a long one, but it did give him a start on his academic career that allowed him to graduate with magna cum laude honors in 1974 and with a Master of Arts degree in 1975 and a wife in 1974 and me in 1975. Finally, he remains the one and only two-time winner of the East Carteret Mariner Award as the school's best all-around athlete, winning the Mariner Award in both his junior and senior years. After graduating at ECU, he taught and coached at Greenville Rose and was an assistant coach for that school's 1975 state championship football team. He later returned home and coached for 2 years at East Carteret before having to find a better way of supporting his growing family that eventually included 6 children. He tells us that he realized that he needed to get a different job when he realized that all of his children qualified for free lunch as a teacher. He started with Farm Bureau, and that was a big day in our family when I was a junior in high school. And he retired there in January of 2017. He is married to the former Susan Leggett, who was herself a 4-year cheerleader at Greenville Rose High. Little did either of them expect that when the Mariners played the Rampants, their future spouse was on the other sideline. He and Susan raised their 6 children on Harker's Island, less than a mile from here, and are now blessed with 17 grandchildren, the 4 eldest of which all lettered in sports at East Carteret last year. He and Susan, I don't like this part. He and Susan will be leaving Harker's Island in a few days. I am sending my oldest daughter to college and my parents to college all in the same week. They are going to do a 1-year teaching assignment at Southern Virginia University in Buena Vista, Virginia this year, where they will be teaching history, family history, church history, genealogy, and marriage and family relations, and they're really good at that. So without further ado, I will introduce my pa, Joel Hancock.
She read it just as I wrote it. Thank you to Allison for especially.
All the way now.
I want to thank Allison for giving me this opportunity. She has assured me that
Gotta be louder.
it didn't have anything to do with the fact that I am her favorite cousin. She said instead it had everything to do with the fact that I was her favorite cousin. I'm doing the best I can about hoping it.
Okay.
Pastor Donald, Principal Steele, Mayor Newton, thank you again for allowing me this opportunity.
Closer.
I didn't feel any, I'm sorry, I'm doing the best I can. I didn't feel any pressure until I found out Sonny Newton was here. Now I got to know I got to pronounce and everything else exactly like I should. So she said she was going to be grading me. I want to talk a little bit tonight about the first 5 years of East Carteret Mariner sports. There's some other people here that were part of that with me, and I think that we remain what Shakespeare called we few, we happy few. I'm
get
so
it
thankful
closer.
that I had that opportunity.
We can't hear it.
Wait, okay.
Right there, yeah.
48 years ago this week, I walked down the landing beside our house to where my father was culling shrimp after a morning drag. My mom and my sister were waiting in a car to take me to East Carolina University, where I was gonna be on the football team that year. As I walked to the landing to my father, he was down in the cockpit of his boat culling shrimp. And I looked down from the dock and say, "Daddy, I'm getting ready to leave." And he stood up and said, "Wait just a minute." Crawled out up onto the dock, gave me a half hug the way fathers did then. Somehow thought it seemed inappropriate for fathers to show much affection then. But as he let go of me and said, "Remember who you are," he asked, "Now where is it you say you're going?" Now, don't get me wrong, my daddy loved me, but fathers were not really, many fathers in that day were not heavily involved in what their sons especially were doing. But remember, this was 1970, and my brother Telford would be leaving for Vietnam within a year. And there were a lot of places we could be going. But what I want to talk about tonight is where I was going that day had everything to do with the fact that I had spent the last 4 years at East Carteret High School playing ball. And everywhere I have been since has been a result of having where I went that day. And so I want to not talk so much about me, but what the environment was and what I was a part of those first 5 years of East Carteret, and especially the 4 years. I was part of the second entering class there. East Carteret, for those of you who don't remember or don't know, was a consolidation of 4 schools. Although it was 3 high schools in Harkers Island, which had a high school a few years before, and then within the next 2 years, Queen Street became part of that consolidation. Those were 4 schools with very proud traditions of their own. Beaufort had been a state champion in basketball several times and in football at least once in just the previous few years. Atlantic was the cradle of teachers for all of down east and had some outstanding baseball players. Smyrna had a baseball and basketball tradition of its own, but it was tired of playing second fiddle to Beaufort for the last 10 years. Harkers Island, which had consolidated with Smyrna in the 50s, had only a basketball team when it was a high school, but it did have several all-county players, including my sister June. Queen Street had excelled in the segregated world of the 40s and 50s, and they sent players to major universities in the north, including Michigan State University, where the Pasteur brothers went and excelled in football and other sports. And they already had started playing a brand of basketball that would soon take over everywhere. 3 of the schools that consolidated into East Carteret had never had a football program. The first 2 years of football and baseball teams that we played at Beaufort High School, more than 40 miles from Cedar Island, 30 miles from Atlantic, 20 miles from Harkers Island. It would be 3 years before the school had their first African-American athletes, and Queen Street High School joined the fold entirely in 1968. Competitive sports at East Carteret in those first 5 years were entirely for boys. I don't know why. There had been girls basketball at Smyrna and Beaufort and Atlantic and even at Harkers Island. But those first 5 years, there was only boys sports. We were initiated into, as Emily mentioned, the Northeastern 3A Conference. Not a single A, not a double C. I'm doing the best I can. The Northeastern 3A Conference that eventually took us all the way to the Virginia line to Elizabeth City and to Roanoke Rapids, and the biggest schools east of Raleigh. Many of our coaches were Korean and even World War II veterans who felt that practice, and especially football practice, was meant to be like boot camp. There were no signed release forms because they were not needed. Chuck Lewis, and I'll go easy on him here, but he started almost every practice with the same 4 words: "I'm not your mama." If your your little finger hurts, I really don't care. That was one of the reasons why we learned early on that we had to take care of ourselves. Thirst for water was considered a sign of weakness. Seriously, Chuck, do you remember we were allowed water halfway through each football practice? My most cogent memory of my playing football is sucking sweat out of a jersey. It's amazing that more of us didn't suffer from heat stroke. Seriously, and then eventually they started giving us salt tablets thinking that we were getting too much water. They wanted to get more of the water out of us. But anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I was lucky to have come up with a group of baby boomer boys that loved playing and that had nothing else to do but play baseball, football, and basketball. Hitchhiking was considered an acceptable means of transportation. And the way, but after practice, there would be lines of us at the end of East Carteret Road, headed to Beaufort and headed down east. Early coaches at East Carteret that first year were from outside of the county, as was the principal, because they didn't want to show, the school board didn't want to show favoritism to any one school. And so they went outside of the county to get that staffing. T.C. Bass was the first football coach. Melvin Boyette was the first basketball coach. Both of them lasted only 2 years. The first baseball coach was John Hamilton from Atlantic, and he lasted for 4 years, and those were important 4 years that I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. My career at East Carteret was shaped largely by Coach Hamilton in baseball and by my JV football and basketball coaches, Tom Hewitt and Otis Johnston. Coach Hamilton decided when I was a sophomore to go with a group of sophomores, 8 of us, and 1 junior on the varsity, largely from down east. And it caused quite a stir at the time, not because of where we were from, but because we replaced 9 upperclassmen who had played the year before. We played on what is now part of the practice field for football, is where our baseball field was, with a backstop made of chicken wire and with the largest bullpen in the state. It literally was across the ditch, a cow pasture with several bulls. There was also lots of clover. And during baseball batting practice, while Paul Dameron was batting, sometimes outfielders would hide in the clover to try and keep avoid him knowing where they are when he was taking batting practice. We wore uniforms that were donated by the United States Marine Corps of Cherry Point. They were made out of wool, and they were adjusted for us by the home ec department, who took the S off of Marines and added an R. We used, because the baseball field was lined by ditches that were full of water all the time, we used rubber baseballs for practice. And the end of practice was the last 10 minutes was retrieving balls from the ditches. I remember one of the most exciting things about playing baseball at East Carteret was the first time in our life that most of us had ever played with white baseballs. But we won our share of games playing against some future major leaguers, including Mike Caldwell, Leo Hart, Chuck Moan from Newbern, and Richard Stilley from Newbern. All would go on to play Major League Baseball, and we played against them at East Carteret in the Northeastern 3A Conference. My senior year in baseball, Coach Hamilton stepped down, and he was replaced by Joe Willis, Joe Boy, a local boy made good. And as Emily mentioned, by our senior year, we were tied for the conference championship, playing against teams as far away as Roanoke Rapids and Elizabeth City. We would leave school before school even started in the morning. We had to get there early. One of the things I'll always remember is that Paul Dameron's mother would make him 2 dozen boiled eggs. 1 dozen to snack on the way there, and another dozen to snack on the way home. Like so many people here, I could tell nothing but Paul Dameron's story. Paul was a great athlete, but he was sort of naive. He would play cards in the dark with Frederick Nelson. And I can remember Paul saying, Frederick, I swear I've seen that card before. Frederick said, no, you ain't, shut up. As I said, by our senior year, we had won the tied for the state conference championship, and I want to mention the boys in that group. Paul Dameron at first base, Chris Chappell at second, Elton Best at shortstop and pitcher, Manley Gaskell at third base, David Lewis in left field or shortstop when Elton pitched, Jim Lewis in center, Walt Glancy in right, Dallas Wayne Arthur was our main pitcher and played center field when Elton pitched, and I was the catcher. That group of boys has remained literally a band of brothers all of my life, and we treasure the memories of Dallas Wayne, Manley, and Walt, who are no longer with us. In football, my first coach was Tom Hewitt, and he would be an important player in my life from that time on. He was a Korean veteran who lived in Beaufort, had been an assistant at Beaufort High School, and he was a complete volunteer. He received no money for any time that he spent at the school. But he was like a father for me for the rest of his life. He called Billy Best, Manley Gaskell, and me his wild Harkers Islanders. Because we were the first 3 Downeasters to play football there on his team. There were 5 on the first team I played on at East Carteret. 5 from Down East, 3 of them for Harkers Island. And he placed us this way: Manley at center, me at right guard, and Billy at right tackle, because he said, being from Harkers Island, we didn't have enough sense to play anywhere but on the line. I looked today in the yearbook for that year, and there we are in that same order: Manley on the end, me next to him, and then Billy beside me. Again, I could tell stories about Tom Hewitt all night. I'm just going to share a couple with you. I remember one night we were playing, there weren't many of us on the team, and so many of us had to go both ways. And Charles Chadwick, Chuck, I don't know if you remember him, he lived out 101, and he left shortly after we graduated. But a linebacker came up lame. And so Coach Hewitt came and quickly asked, can anyone here play linebacker? And Charles was sort of, he was a real hard worker, a real hitter, but he was a little small for linebacker. And so when he said that, can anyone here play linebacker? And Charles volunteered. Tom thought for a moment and said, can anybody else here play linebacker? Another time, in a similar way, he asked someone what went down at defensive end. And I'll mention his name because he was such a good friend, and he's the one who loves to tell the story, but Bubba Willis spoke up and volunteered. I can, Coach. And I'm not going to say it exactly like Tom did, but he looked at him and said, one other story about that, and I'll get over. We had a defensive lineman, offensive lineman, who was very big. He just wasn't a very good ball player. But he was there because he was good for practicing against. And I remember we were losing bad to Elizabeth City, and Coach Hewitt went down to the bench and said, called him by name, you going in? He said, that's all right, Coach, I've already been here once. When the weather was bad, or if it was too late at night, Tom Hewitt would drive us all the way to Harkers Island after practice rather than going straight home. I'll always appreciate him. That was just one of the many things he did for us. We had to learn to put on our equipment, literally. For those of you who have ever put thigh pads into a football pair of football pants, if you put them in the wrong way, it can be very painful. I learned that by sad experience. We played bull in the ring, and we played head-on tackling between the dummies, and there was no way out of it. You had to do that, or you couldn't play. I have more distinct and lasting memories from football, and especially football practice, than from anything else I ever did at East Carteret High School. And I'm thankful for those coaches who had the patience to work with those wild Harkers Islanders. For my junior year, the football coaches were Dick Fitzsimmons and again Chuck Lewis. And they taught me, and that football was really not just a game of hitting, but it was a thinking man's game. And you had to be as prepared mentally as you were physically. I went from being a down lineman as a sophomore to being an upright quarterback running an I formation and a pro set offense in the Northeastern 3A Conference by the time I was a junior. I remember we played Greenville Rose at home, and during those days, football was never canceled for weather. And we played football in a rainstorm that would make this week's rain look like a shower. I remember a quarterback and a defensive lineman from Greenville threw me down, and I kept sliding all the way past our bench, all the way into that fence in front of the bleachers. Little did I know that my wife-to-be was on the other sideline. After the 6th game of that year, I broke my collarbone, and that ended football for my junior year. In my senior year, those coaches were replaced by Tom Jones, a successful state champion coach at Four Oaks High School. And if Chuck would, we could really tell some stories about Tom Jones. We have Robert Jones, no relation, as an assistant coach. Tom Jones believed that it took less talent and ability to pass than to throw. And so we became one of the very first primarily passing teams in Eastern North Carolina. By my senior year, we were throwing 50 and 60 times a game, which was quite unusual in those days. With Chris Chappell then at quarterback, Frank Knight at fullback, but mostly so he could help block for Chris, and then with Sylvester Johnson, Billy Best, and me as the receivers, we won our share of games. And it was in football that as I said, I got the attention from the coaches at East Carolina University. 3 things about Tom Jones. He said he took his wife with him everywhere he went because he'd rather do that than kiss her goodbye. 2 years later, when his team didn't do very well and at the awards banquet, I remember he introduced the players with this preamble. He said, "I want you to know that I love these boys." He said, "Now mamas and daddies, next to you, I love them more than anybody loves them. But you can't win the Kentucky Derby with a jackass." My senior year, the consolidation hit full stride in the state, and 4 schools in Pasquotank County joined to form Elizabeth City Northeastern High School. We had 18 players by the end of the year, and that was our last game when Elizabeth City came with 3 bus loads: an offensive bus, a defensive bus, and a special teams bus. And as we were lined up on the field and those buses pulled up and the players got out, Tom Jones would look at them, and he'd look at us. He'd look at them, and then look at us, and finally he said, "Boys, try not to get hurt." In basketball, Otis Johnson taught me more about life and coaching than almost anyone I'd ever known. He was from Bayboro, and he ended up teaching and supervising bus drivers for the county for over 30 years. But for 3 years, he was an important part of my life. He let me play point guard just so he could hear me call out numbers. He was so fascinated by how people from Harker's Island talk. Now this is the truth, I'm not making this up, and the people that were there will remind us. He made us shave our heads to show that we were committed. Now this was 1968, 69, and 70, when hair was everything. Every 2 weeks, we had to report to a barber and shave our head with a number 2 crew-cut blade. He made us wear black low cuts with Target socks when everyone else in the world wore white high-top Converse All-Stars with knee-high socks. But he taught us the fundamentals of playing basketball, and in my my sophomore year, for the first time ever, we beat West Carteret in basketball. For my senior year, Coach Tom McQuaid, the man, the legend, returned and began a long stint of coaching at East Carteret High School. By then, we boys from down east had basically taken over the basketball program, which was an adjustment for him and for some others. But by the time the season started, and for most of that year, the starting lineup included Mike Copes, who had started out at Queen Street in Beaufort, and 4 boys from Harkers Island, Manley Gaskell, Alton and Billy Best, and me. We were given an affectionate name that I can't share with you now. But there are some people now that still remind me of that. East Carteret High School Mariner Athletics allowed me to live this life, this dream of a life that I've had this last 50 years. Everything that has mattered to me since I left East Carteret has been related in one way or another to that. Had it not been for playing ball at East Carteret, I never would have gone to college. And if I hadn't gone to East Carolina, Emily, Joel, Mike, Allie, Leah, Joella wouldn't be here, because it was there that I met their mother. And that was the most important thing that's ever happened in my life. But again, it was depended entirely on the opportunities I had, because I played ball at East Carteret High School. In closing, I want to thank the faculty, the staff, and my teammates there who were with me those 4 years at East Carteret, and especially the coaches. I'm glad that Chuck is here as one of them to represent all of them. I want to thank those coaches who turned this wild Harkers Islander into a somewhat less wild Mariner. Thank you very much.